If you remember watching any American news media during the period when it was dominated by coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing, then you almost certainly remember seeing the police sketches of the two guys the FBI was looking for in connection to the bombing. There was a sketch of John Doe number 1, which turned out to be a stunningly accurate depiction of Timothy McVeigh. But then there was another sketch, John Doe number 2, a man described as swarthy or olive-complected, with curly black hair and a distinctive tattoo on his left arm, who'd been seen with John Doe number 1 during the lead-up to the bombing. The FBI distributed the John Doe number 2 sketch to the media in the aftermath of the bombing, describing him as John Doe 1's co-conspirator. But then, 2 months later, the FBI suddenly changed their story. Now they said it was all just a case of mistaken identity. Rather than being an accomplice, they said John Doe number 2 was just some random guy who a witness had mistakenly assumed was with McVeigh in a Ryder truck rental shop. The media and judicial system dropped the matter completely, and defense attorneys were barred from raising the issue of the second John Doe during the trials related to the bombing. But in the years since McVeigh's execution, after the case faded from public memory, formerly secret documents released through FOIA requests, lawsuits, and government leaks have produced overwhelming evidence of what many had long suspected. The FBI knew that John Doe number 2 was real all along and staged a massive cover-up to hide it. It turned out that John Doe number 2 wasn't just seen with McVeigh at the Ryder truck rental shop. Witnesses had seen McVeigh with an unidentified second man in a strip club just days before the bombing, bragging to the strippers about how he was about to be famous. A tire store employee described seeing McVeigh with another man on the morning of the bombing when the two pulled over to ask for directions to the Murrah building, just minutes before the bomb was planted there. A security guard even told local news stations that he had watched McVeigh park the Ryder truck outside of the Murrah building, and a second man hopped out of the passenger side and fled with McVeigh. In fact, the FBI was so convinced that John Doe number 2 was real that their agents tortured a federal prisoner to death during an interrogation in his jail cell because they thought he was John Doe number 2, months after the Bureau had publicly declared that John Doe 2 never existed. And yet somehow, despite all of this, in the years since, the story of John Doe number 2 has disappeared down the memory hole for the entire country. Witnesses placed John Doe number 2 at the scene of the crime with the murder weapon, and yet we went through McVeigh's manhunt, his capture, years of trials and appeals, and his execution without his main accomplice ever being identified. So why was the FBI so desperate to cover up John Doe number 2's existence? What was so important about this guy that federal agents would lie under oath, sabotage investigations, and even torture a man to death to keep it secret? According to the official story, on Wednesday, April 19, 1995, a far-right lone wolf terrorist named Timothy McVeigh drove a Ryder truck laden with explosives into Oklahoma City by himself and parked it outside of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, where it would explode at 9:02 a.m., taking out most of the building and 167 innocent people with it. The building had long been a target of anti-government extremists in the Midwest, largely because it served as a regional headquarters for federal agencies like the ATF and DEA. In fact, other extremists had been caught in previous years plotting their own unsuccessful attacks on the building. Although he wouldn't be connected to the bombing for a few more days, Timothy McVeigh would be pulled over in a 1977 Mercury Marquis with no license plates just 90 minutes after the explosion and arrested on charges of carrying a concealed weapon. Within days, the feds would take McVeigh into custody under suspicion of involvement in the bombing and begin their frantic search for evidence against him in what was then the deadliest terror attack in American history. The FBI would take over the investigation, digging into McVeigh's background and tracing his movements in the days and weeks before the bombing. McVeigh was a veteran of the First Gulf War who had left the Army after washing out of Special Forces training. Some have described McVeigh as paranoid upon his return to civilian life. He had once claimed that the Army had implanted a microchip in his butt to track his movements, but it wasn't until the events of the Ruby Ridge standoff and the Waco siege that McVeigh would fully embrace anti-government ideology, attending gun shows all over the Midwest to sell guns and pass out literature, and fraternizing with far-right and white separatist groups in the years before the bombing. McVeigh would never leave prison again after his concealed carry arrest, being convicted for the bombing and serving time at the Supermax USP Florence Federal Prison and USP Terre Haute until his execution was finally carried out in 2001. During his years of incarceration, McVeigh's account of his own life story would vary wildly, and these inconsistencies make it difficult to trust his autobiographical claims, so this video will not include any information for which McVeigh is the only source. And to be clear, McVeigh's two identified accomplices, Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier, are not John Doe number 2. Both men were eliminated from contention early on because they couldn't possibly have been in the places at the times where John Doe number 2 was seen with McVeigh. Although Nichols and Fortier were accomplices, their participation was mostly around the edges, with material and logistical support. John Doe number 2, whoever he is, was much more closely involved in the attack than Nichols and Fortier were. Within days of the bombing, with McVeigh already in custody, the FBI announced to the media that they were seeking 2 men in connection with the bombing, John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2. According to the Bureau, they had traced the VIN number on the axle of the exploded Ryder truck to a rental place in Kansas, and an employee there remembered seeing 2 men renting the truck in question. One was skinny and tall with a buzz cut. The sketch produced from this description became John Doe number 1 and was quickly identified as depicting Timothy McVeigh. The second suspect was described as being about 5'9", muscular with tan or olive-complected skin, and a tattoo of a dragon on his left forearm, wearing a black baseball cap. The sketch produced from this description became John Doe number 2, and both sketches were distributed to media across the country. But at the same time the FBI was announcing their national search for the John Does, Oklahoma City media was beginning their own parallel investigation into the bombing. Multiple survivors who'd been in the Murrah building that morning told local TV stations that they'd spoken to ATF agents at the scene, who admitted that no ATF employees had died in the blast, because they'd been warned not to come into work that day.
What he told him is that he thought that they had received a tip that morning of the bomb.
Yet another witness, a rescue worker, says after she talked with an agent at the bombing scene, she also suspected the ATF was warned and agents stayed away from their office that morning.
I asked him if his office was in the building, and he said yes, and I asked if there were any ATF agents that were still in the building, and he said no, we weren't here.
I spotted a ATF officer in a jacket that signified that it was ATF personnel. And he just came out and told me that the ATF wasn't in the building that day. They'd been tipped by their pagers not to come to work, which I was flabbergasted. You know, I didn't ask this guy this question. This is just what came out of his mouth.
Did he go further to explain why they were told not to come to work?
They were tipped by their pagers of a bomb threat that morning.
Other ATF agents realized the gravity of these admissions and quickly began concocting stories to tell the media about the supposed heroism of ATF agents that day. One agent claimed that he'd been in an elevator when the bomb went off, and the elevator had suddenly dropped down several floors, after which he made a quick escape and began helping the injured. The general manager of the company that built the Murrah Building's elevators was interviewed about the ATF agent's story, and he said that the design of the Murrah Building's elevators made a freefall drop impossible, so the agent's version of events couldn't possibly be true. Just hours after the bombing, before McVeigh had been publicly identified as a suspect, local media found an employee at a tire store just blocks from the Murrah building who said that minutes before the blast, a Ryder truck had pulled into his store's parking lot, and the 2 men inside the truck asked for directions to the Murrah building. The employees' descriptions of the men matched Timothy McVeigh and John Doe number 2 exactly.
The morning of April 19th, I was working at Johnny's Tire Store. At about approximately 8:25, a Ryder truck pulled up into my place of business. At that time, a gentleman asked me for directions to 5th and Harvey. I proceeded to explain the location of where he was asking me. He seemed to be a little concerned of where I was telling him about. At that time, the gentleman, Timothy McVeigh, stepped out of the truck. I walked him over to, let's say, 10, 11 feet away from the truck itself. I pointed a direction downtown, which is to my right. He seemed to acknowledge where I was talking about. At that time, the gentleman walked back to the truck. I talked to him. I also noticed there was a passenger in the truck at that time. From that point in time, the Ryder truck seemed to stay there about another 5 minutes and headed the direction I explained where it was at. 4 days after the bombing, or 3 days after the bombing, the government took me downtown to identify the gentleman. Under what I can understand, I did identify the gentleman as being Timothy McVeigh.
Did they have the passenger, which was with McVeigh? Was he in a lineup also?
No, he was not. At that time, I've never even actually seen, at that time, before the John Doe actually 2 number come out, I'd never even seen a photo, a sketch, nothing like that. And also, when I did identify Timothy McVeigh, I had not even seen him. The only way I'd ever seen him was through a sketch on a paper at Daily, Oklahoma.
Do you have any doubt in your mind that there was a passenger in the Ryder truck?
That's even more. I have no doubt there was definitely a second person, no matter what. There was 2 people in this vehicle.
A local TV station also spoke to a whistleblower who had been working security for a business right next to the bomb site. The morning of the explosion, that security guard had been watching a surveillance camera that covered the front of the Murrah building. The guard said that their camera had captured the Ryder truck pulling up and parking outside of the building.
But a bombing witness accurately described what happened next to News Channel 4.
Standing in the building, and I looked out the window, and I seen the Ryder's truck, and I seen the man get out of the Ryder's truck.
One man, who the witness identified as McVeigh, exited the truck, followed by a second man moments later, after which the two men made their escape minutes before the explosion. The security guard's employer recognized the importance of the footage immediately and contacted the FBI. After viewing the surveillance tape, the FBI agents confiscated the only copy of the footage. In the weeks after the bombing, the FBI would leak to the media that they were in possession of surveillance video showing the Ryder truck being parked outside of the Murrah building.
John Doe number 2 has not been identified and remains at large. He should be considered armed and extremely dangerous.
The FBI says it has obtained videotapes from security cameras in the vicinity of the blast and may have tape of the Ryder rental truck used to house the enormous bomb.
But the Bureau refused to let anyone else see the video. Once McVeigh was charged and defense lawyers began asking to see the tape, the FBI changed their story. Now they claimed that the tape never existed. The Bureau stuck to the story for over a decade, until finally, in 2009, a judge overseeing a lawsuit against them forced the FBI to release 26 of the 244 surveillance tapes they had taken from cameras surrounding the Murrah building. Incredibly, of the only 4 videos that actually showed the area where the bomb was planted, every single one of them was missing the minutes before the explosion that would have shown the men parking the Ryder truck and abandoning it. But we do have some hints about what was in the missing sections. A Secret Service document describes security videotapes in the agency's possession, which depict, quote, the truck detonation 3 minutes and 6 seconds after the suspects, plural, exited the truck. And every once in a while, an agent who worked on the case will mess up and admit that they, too, have seen this non-existent surveillance video.
We had him on videotape at the McDonald's at the FBI building, right across from the FBI building in Oklahoma. We had a videotape of the truck being pulled up at a couple minutes toward 9. It was things like that.
On April 8, 1995, less than 2 weeks before the bombing, Timothy McVeigh went to a strip club in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Lady Godiva's. He was accompanied by a second man, who the girls described as having black hair and a thick German-sounding accent. This would be unremarkable, except for one detail. The strip club had installed cameras in the dressing rooms with sound, and on the night of McVeigh's visit, the cameras caught one of the girls discussing her interactions with McVeigh's table. She said that when she approached the two men, one of them, later identified as McVeigh, started bragging to her about how he was about to become famous.
He goes, I'm a very smart man. I said, you are? And he goes, yes. And you're going to remember me on April of 1995. You're going to remember me for the rest of your life.
On August 21, 1995, Wilma Trentadue received a call from the warden of the Oklahoma City Federal Transfer Center, a federal prison located in Oklahoma City, informing her that her son, Kenny Trentadue, had committed suicide in his prison cell the night before. Bizarrely, the warden offered to cremate Kenny's body at the government's expense, an unprecedented offer coming from a federal prison. But Wilma declined, and 5 days later, when Kenny's body arrived at the mortuary the family had chosen, she discovered the real reason for the prison's generous offer. Kenny's body was covered in bruises, from his head literally to the soles of his feet, with ruptures on his scalp and both ligature and slash marks on his throat. The prison had hastily concealed most of Kenny's injuries with makeup, the first step in a cover-up that would last for years. The prison put out a press release claiming Kenny had died from suicide by asphyxiation, but the state medical examiner strongly disagreed, classifying Kenny's death as a likely murder. Soon after, Kenny's brother, Salt Lake City attorney Jesse Trentadue, received an anonymous call in which the caller detailed the FBI's role in his brother's death.
The caller said that my brother had been killed by the FBI, that it was an interrogation that had gone wrong, terribly wrong, that it was a case of mistaken identity. He had fit the profile of a group of individuals who were robbing banks and armored cars and using the money to attack the federal government.
Through lawsuits and FOIA requests, Jesse would conduct his own investigation, discovering that Kenny's clothes, bed sheets, and boxers had disappeared from his cell, and the cell itself was scrubbed clean and repainted, literally within hours of the discovery of Kenny's body, sabotaging any chance at a real investigation of the crime scene. Despite the repainting, blood from an unidentified second person was found inside the cell, along with Kenny's blood, and the noose which prison guards had supposedly cut Kenny down from didn't have any cut marks on it. The state medical examiner refused to bow to FBI pressure to classify Kenny's death as a suicide, telling a local TV station, quote, "I think it's very likely Kenny was murdered. I'm not able to prove it. You see a body covered with blood, removed from the room as Mr. Trentadue was, soaked in blood, covered with bruises, and you try to gain access to the scene, and the government of the United States says no, you can't. At that point, we have no crime scene, so there are still questions about the death of Kenneth Trentadue that will never be answered because of the actions of the U.S. government. Whether those actions were intentional, whether they were incompetence, I don't know. It was botched, or worse, it was planned." Years later, shortly before he was scheduled to be executed, Jesse Trentadue received a message from Timothy McVeigh.
Who said that when I saw your brother's picture and heard what happened to him, I knew they, being the FBI, had killed him because they thought it was Richard Lee Guthrie.
Guthrie, a bank robber for the white separatist Aryan Republican Army, bore a striking resemblance to Kenny Trentadue. Guthrie was 5'8", Kenny was 5'8". Both were muscular, with the same color hair, and both had a dragon tattoo on their left forearm. Kenny had been arrested in the same model car Richard Lee Guthrie was known to drive on a probation violation for a bank robbery, the exact same crime that Guthrie was wanted for. The two men's descriptions matched each other's exactly, but more importantly, they matched the FBI's working description of John Doe No. 2. Over the next decade plus of court hearings, government leaks, and FOIA disclosures, Jesse Trentadue would slowly piece together the facts of his brother's death. The FBI thought that Kenny Trentadue was an alias of Richard Lee Guthrie, and they believed Richard Lee Guthrie was John Doe No. 2, McVeigh's accomplice in the bombing. FBI agents had interrogated Trentadue in his cell, torturing him so severely that he was bruised from his face to the bottoms of his feet, and when a confession wasn't forthcoming, they went overboard, killing Kenny in the process. Jesse Trentadue's investigation uncovered so much evidence of murder that Utah Senator Orrin Hatch initiated the process of opening a Senate investigation into Kenny's death. But the FBI lied to his office about the evidence they had in their possession, and the Senate investigation never materialized. Jesse Trentadue's efforts unearthed other embarrassing information about the federal investigation, like the fact that a Southern Poverty Law Center spy had infiltrated the white supremacist compound where McVeigh spent time, and had informed the FBI of the bombing plot some 2 weeks before the attack. Jesse Trentadue would sue the federal government and be awarded over $1 million for crimes related to his brother's death, but the FBI's cover-up of Kenny's murder persists to this day. It's notable that the torture of Kenny Trentadue occurred in mid-August of 1995, even though the FBI had already announced their identification of John Doe No. 2 as an innocent bystander on June 14th, some 2 months earlier. Despite what the FBI was saying publicly, they were still desperately searching for the second John Doe. The real Richard Lee Guthrie would be arrested on bank robbery charges in January 1996, and just days after announcing his intent to give an interview to the LA Times that would, quote, blow the lid off of the Oklahoma City bombing, Guthrie was found hanging in his federal prison cell. Richard Lee Guthrie is one candidate for the true identity of John Doe No. 2. Others have proposed Michael Brescia or Dennis Mayen, but perhaps the strongest candidate for the true identity of John Doe No. 2 is a German national who was deep in the same far-right political scene as McVeigh and almost certainly knew about McVeigh's plans in advance of the attack, a man named Andreas Strassmeyer. Strassmeyer was born into privilege in his native Germany, the son of the chief of staff to German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. In the 1980s, Strassmeyer would move to the United States, hoping to work, by his own admission, for, quote, the operations section of the DEA. When leveraging his father's political connections to find such work proved insufficient, Strassmeyer would overstay his visa and throw himself into far-right underground politics, going to the same Midwestern gun shows and fraternizing with many of the same white separatist groups that Timothy McVeigh would later come to be involved in. Some have speculated that Strassmeyer had actually been successful in finding federal employment, and that some agency of the federal government, like the FBI, DEA, or ATF, was sending Strassmeyer to these gun shows and extremist meetings as a paid federal informant. Either way, it's now beyond dispute that the white separatist compound where Strassmeyer lived and where McVeigh would spend much of his time in the months before the bombing, Elohim City, was crawling with federal informants. First, there was the unnamed SPLC spy who had informed the FBI of the planned attack weeks before it was carried out. But more importantly, an ATF informant named Carol Howe had spent countless hours at Elohim City in the months before the bombing, and she told the ATF that she'd heard Strassmeyer say, quote, "It's time to start bombing federal buildings." She told her ATF handlers that she'd gone on multiple runs to Oklahoma City in the months before the attack with Strassmeyer and another white supremacist named Dennis Mahon, in which they scoped out the Murrah building as a potential target for a bombing. The federal government was so scared of the information in Carol Howe's brain that during Timothy McVeigh's trial, they indicted Howe on charges related to a bomb threat, for which she would later be acquitted, charges which her own lawyer decried as a blatant attempt to keep Howe silent while McVeigh's trial was ongoing. Besides his strong resemblance to the John Doe No. 2 sketch and talk of blowing up federal buildings, Strassmeyer was also identified as the man with the German accent who had accompanied McVeigh to the strip club days before the bombing, where he had bragged about how he was going to become famous on April 19, 1995. And according to Strassmeyer's lawyer, Kirk Lyons, in January of 1996, Strassmeyer was evacuated from the United States on a plane furnished by the German government's elite anti-terrorism special operations group, GS-9, the equivalent of America's Delta Force. His lawyer claimed this was the German government's idea, necessary for safety reasons, but it is highly suspicious that the anti-terror arm of the German government would go so far out of their way to evacuate a gun-obsessed, white supremacist illegal immigrant in the United States. Strassmeyer was never arrested or even interviewed by the FBI or any federal agency investigating the Oklahoma City bombing. Some have speculated that beyond being an informant, Strassmeyer may have been an operative for a law enforcement cooperation agreement between the American and German governments. Throughout the 1980s, far-right groups in the U.S. had been attempting to expand into Germany and opening up branches of American extremist groups on German soil. To thwart this process, American federal agencies agreed to cooperate with their German counterparts to suppress right-wing activity in the United States to contain those groups most likely to spread into Germany. Could Strassmeyer have been part of some kind of exchange program between the U.S. and German governments, sent to subvert the spread of radical right-wing ideas into Europe? The fact that the German government's anti-terror squad swooped in to exfiltrate a supposed neo-Nazi right after his friends had committed a terror attack makes this theory seem plausible at the very least. But perhaps the real reason John Doe No. 2 was never conclusively identified is because there was no single John Doe No. 2, but rather John Does numbers 2, 3, 4, or more. The official story is that on April 18th, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols drove the Ryder truck that McVeigh had rented the day before to the shore of a lake in a state park in Kansas, where they assembled the bomb in the back of the truck. But 4 separate witnesses in that Kansas state park would tell the FBI that they had seen the same model of Ryder truck parked in the exact same location on the lake the day before April 18th, when McVeigh wasn't even in the state. At the motel where McVeigh stayed in the days before the bombing, witnesses saw McVeigh with 2 other men, neither of whom were Terry Nichols or Michael Fortier, the only 2 people who were ever convicted of crimes related to the bombing besides McVeigh. Parked outside of the room was a Ryder truck, days before McVeigh had rented one. Another witness, a delivery man for a local Chinese restaurant who had delivered food to McVeigh's room, said that the man who answered the door and paid for the food wasn't McVeigh, Nichols, or Fortier. All of this information was kept out of McVeigh's trial, dismissed as irrelevant by the judge, and has been ignored in the official history of the attack. The evidence of at least one co-conspirator aiding McVeigh in his terror attack, from the planning stage right up until the bomb was planted, is overwhelming, and the FBI was certainly aware of this. We have FBI agents on video admitting they've seen the surveillance tapes that showed McVeigh and John Doe No. 2 exiting the Ryder truck. We have reports from multiple informants saying that McVeigh had discussed the attack with numerous other right-wing extremists. We have FBI interviews with witnesses who saw McVeigh with other men during the preparation for the attack. We have Strassmeyer avoiding any questioning from the FBI and being whisked away by the German government despite his close proximity to the plot. But even more importantly, we have the fact that the FBI intentionally edited the surveillance tapes which would have proven the existence of a second John Doe, which suggests not just incompetence, but a willful cover-up. It's clear that the cover-up happened, but the most important question still remains: why? What secret did the FBI think was so important that they'd let co-conspirators in the worst terror attack in U.S. history escape punishment? Some think it was to cover up their own incompetence. If multiple federal agencies had informants inside the conspiracy submitting tips about the bomb plot, practically begging their handlers to take the threat seriously, and those agencies failed to act, it begs the question, what is the point of having all these federal police and informants if they can't even protect the public? Some have speculated that the informants who had infiltrated the plot were too directly involved, and instead of just passively observing McVeigh, they had encouraged or materially aided him with the attack planning or bomb construction. Some ex-informants have alleged that the attack was a botched federal operation under the program named PATCON, or Patriot Conspiracy, an FBI operation targeting the radical right in the United States, where the feds had used informants to entrap McVeigh in a bombing plot, but at the last minute, they failed to make the arrest in time, either intentionally or unintentionally. In this scenario, the FBI would be directly responsible for fomenting a terror attack against U.S. citizens, and the cover-up was to ensure that this information never came out. This could also help explain why McVeigh seemed to be surrounded by informants everywhere he went. Others believe the feds knew about the attack beforehand, but allowed it to happen to stigmatize the far right or to provoke funding increases for the agencies. After the embarrassments of Ruby Ridge and Waco, the federal law enforcement agencies were struggling for legitimacy, but if the feds could point to a dangerous domestic terror threat capable of inflicting such extreme damage, politicians and voters might be less inclined to cut the agency's budgets or seek accountability for the disasters of the early 90s. This theory seems at least plausible in light of the ATF agents' admission that they were warned about the attack beforehand. And then there are those who suspect the attack was a federal plot from the beginning, and McVeigh himself was some kind of federal operative who either got tricked into carrying it out or willfully participated as a good soldier for his government. McVeigh himself even flirted with this interpretation, claiming at various times to have been recruited into a top-secret special forces program and domestic intelligence operations on American soil. Whatever the FBI's true motive, the case as it stands is damning enough. At the very least, the Bureau sat by and did nothing while a totally preventable terror attack was carried out right under their noses. At worst, they knowingly provoked, or failed to stop, a terror attack by surrounding an unbalanced veteran with informants eager to stoke his most deranged ambitions. And no matter what version of the story turns out to be true, the fact remains that at least one of the central participants in the Oklahoma City bombing plot has never faced justice, and may very well still be a free man to this day.